I don't know that they're guilty, but I believe that there's the potential there. I think one of the things that surprised me the most about this case was when I found out there'd been a murder, I wasn't surprised. And usually when you hear that there's a murder of someone you know, I mean, there's shock, et cetera, but I wasn't surprised.
Were you surprised when the family was fingered as the potential suspects?
No.
After a dozen years of being suspects, the entire Ramsey family was officially cleared.
People have asked me, well, was that like a celebratory moment? Well, no, it wasn't. It was like, okay, now let's solve the case.
But the case went cold again.
Well, every day was Christmas to Jean Benet. She had a wonderful life. I often looked at her, and Burke as well, and thought that how wonderful life had been to them.
To come out and say, we definitely conclude that these folks can be exonerated is an inaccurate portrayal of the evidence.
Current Boulder DA Stan Garnett says an apology to the Ramseys was inappropriate.
It created the impression that the evidence in the case is much clearer than it is. The evidence is very compromised.
As a manager, I was shocked. Number one, I thought maybe, there would be could be a lawsuit, et cetera, but it was just very inappropriate behavior. And I also noticed that there was a lot of enmeshment between the daughters and Nedra. I believe that Nedra called a lot of the shots. And
that little old lady, the grandma?
Well, I think that we all have a public persona, and then there's another persona people have.
Then in 2013, another bombshell.
I had a strong sense that there was a huge story here that had been missed.
Dogged reporter Charlie Brennan investigated and broke a shocking story.
I was able to persuade several grand jurors to confirm for me the fact that they had voted to indict.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Well, it's been almost 2 months since we did an episode on peripheral figures. Remember, we did a couple of handwriting experts, Sina Wong, Donald Foster. We also did Mike Bynum. What do you say we continue, we commence with that series? And so in this analysis, we're going to deal with John Fernie. Have you ever seen a picture of John Fernie? Well, the Fernies are arguably the lowest profile folks in the inner circle of Ramsey friends. For people who were at the center of this case, the epicenter really, from the get-go, and for several hours, days, and weeks afterwards, it's astonishing how successfully the Fernies were at ducking all the media exposure. Because as I say, let me ask you a question. Have you ever seen a photo of John Fernie? I'm not sure I have. Now, not to put too fine a point on it, when you look closely at the Fernies in this story, things don't quite seem to add up. Let's start with John Fernie's testimony under oath in a separate case, a separate trial in June 2001. By the way, Fleet White was also subpoenaed to testify at this same trial, but Fleet White refused, and I think he got into trouble over that, legal trouble. The trial involved allegations that certain individuals conspired to buy the ransom note, the Ramsey ransom note, for the Globe tabloid for $30,000. Now, in a previous episode I said maybe it's time that we spoke a little bit about the tabloid narrative. Someone was saying, well, the tabloids are trash. There's nothing at all that's true in it. Well, imagine if the tabloids had gotten hold of the Ramsey ransom note. That would have been a massive exclusive, a massive scoop. And are you telling me if they'd published the ransom note that had absolutely zero value, that that's just tabloid trash? In any event, we're going to deal with the testimony of John Fernie, but before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, I've written a number of books on this case. One of them is Christmas Star. It's been very well reviewed. If you're interested in my most recent thoughts on the case, you might want to read that particular book. Christmas Star is also available as an audiobook, also available in paperback, and also available narrated by me on Patreon on, I think, the $10 tier. I'll put a link to that audiobook narrated by me in the description as well. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, interesting, meaningful, please do hit the thanks button, because of course your support ensures that we continue our coverage of this case. And let's continue. All right, here is the transcript of John Fernie's testimony. You can see it is against the plaintiff John C. Miller, and it is dated June 13th, 2001, less than 2 years after the grand jury verdict. Now, what we need to appreciate is that this is an extremely rare sample of John Fernie talking on the record on the Ramsey case. We know John Fernie and his wife Barbara also testified to the grand jury, but we don't know about what. And so let's deal with the first page of that transcript. The court. We're now ready to continue, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Mr. Lozo, I call John Fernie, the court. Now try to visualize this. If you could step up to the witness stand and raise your right hand. John Fernie, called as a witness, being first duly sworn, was examined and testified as follows. He says, I do, obviously in response to, do you swear to tell the truth? The court. Please be seated and state your name for the record. John Fernie, Fernie. Then the direct examination starts. Mr. Fernie, you are here under our subpoena, is that correct? Fernie, yes. Let me direct your attention back to late December of 1996 and ask if you were a friend of the Ramsey family. Answer, yes. In that regard, did you have occasion to be involved in the tragedy involving the Ramsey child, John Bonet? Yes. Now, let me warn you, almost before Fernie's testimony begins, it's over. And since, to reiterate, this is an extremely rare statement from John Fernie on the record, because as far as I'm aware, they gave not one, nada, zero interviews to the media. Let's go through this carefully, line by line, step by step. So Fernie acknowledges he was a friend of the Fernies, but he isn't asked in what capacity. The answer is likely that the Ramseys knew the Fernies and became friends with them in church. They went to church together. Remember that because the church comes up prominently later on in the story. John Fernie is also not asked what he does for a living. As I understand it, he was a developer in Boulder, so I suppose that suggests he was fairly wealthy. It's not clear whether John Fernie's relationship with John Ramsey extended further or deeper than through their shared church membership and attendance. I mean, in some kind of business capacity. But since we don't know, I guess we can assume there wasn't. Now let's go back to the transcript. Mr. Fernie, did you have occasion to come to the Ramsey home in the early morning hours, I believe December 26th, at the behest of one of the members of the Ramsey family? Fernie answers, yes. What happened when you first arrived? Fernie answers, I drove my car up the alley and parked in the back of their house and went around to the patio door, which was a glass door leading into the kitchen and back of the house, and didn't see anybody. But I saw a piece. Whoa. Now there's a lot to unpack here. Unfortunately, Fernie isn't asked at what time the call came through. And as I understand it, Patsy called and then John Fernie's wife Barbara answered. I could be wrong about that. And then John immediately took off because he understood that it was an emergency. Now we are going to verify who answered the call, but I think what is really interesting to ask here is which phone call, who was the first person the Ramseys called that morning, and in what order and at what time. Since Patsy hadn't said what the emergency was about, John Fernie assumed on the way while driving that John had had a heart attack. Now what's also important to note is that Fernie approached the house from the opposite side to the first responding officer, Rick French. He describes going around to the patio door and approaching a glass door which provides access to the kitchen. And in order to understand what he's talking about, we really do need to look at this graphic and plot a little dotted line from the garage that's on the top of the picture, round the side, and when he comes to, it's really the second doorway, because there is a door that goes straight into the garage. But if you go round the study, that is the door that is referring to. Now, let's be clear what you're talking about. Fernie approaches from the garage side of the home, the top of the schematic, but the bottom of this image. You can see that part jutting out to the right-hand side of this aerial image, right? And so he follows the walkways around the right side of the garage. He goes around the study and he actually walks directly below the balcony of John Bonet's bedroom to the kitchen door. From the aerial image of the home, John Fernie is standing within the first gap between the square new addition and the older, steeper, gabled Tudor-style structure on the other side, the side facing 15th Street. John Bonet's room is on the newer side. It's that sort of middle section which doesn't actually have windows in those gaps on the balcony. And so what we're dealing with, the door that he approaches is not this door. This is the butler pantry door on the opposite side of the house and at the lower level than the kitchen. Let's go back to that graphic and have a look. Can you see where the butler door is? Look at the squares. Those should actually be black and white squares on the floor. That is on that side of the house. That is not the side that John Fernie approaches. But if we stay on that side and we pull back, again, it's not this door, which is the same door with glass panels on either side. What I'm trying to show you here is this is also a glass door. It's really pretty incredible how much glass and window was in that home. It was literally kind of like an aquarium. So it's not that glass door. No, Fernie uses this glass door. And you can see it's also made of glass and has a window to the right. And if you zoom outwards, backwards, it's actually this entrance. And if you zoom even further back, you can see where John Fernie was standing. It was right beside the grate where the intruder apparently went in and exited. Look closer. And if we pull back even further, it's this famous perspective popularized by Detective Lou Smit. Now, one can imagine John Fernie rushes to the Ramsey home, understanding it's an emergency, and knocks on the door. When you open what is effectively the kitchen door, it doesn't open directly into the kitchen, but into the little hallway with a spiral staircase at the end of it. The kitchen is actually to the right. On the other side of the wall on the right is the kitchen phone. So if John Fernie arrived early, he rapped loudly on the glass door, and that's actually not what he did, but it's what one could assume he did from reading thus far in the transcript. You know, while he's waiting in the cold for someone to answer, he probably stepped to the right beside the basement window grate, and peered impatiently through the kitchen window. And on the kitchen counter, right by the window, apparently there lay the original ransom note. Now, this suggests that just before he arrived, Rick French picked up the note off the floor, I believe, not off the stairs, briefly examined it, and then placed it inside the kitchen right beside the window. Except that is not what John Fernie said. He said that he saw the note on the floor through the window and not in the kitchen in that sort of hallway.
Not what you said. You said you were...
Recall what I said.
I can have the court reporter read back to you.
I know what I said. I don't have to have it read back to me like I'm...
Why did you order?
Let's go back to see exactly what John Fernie said about this delicate moment when he approaches the house. He talks about a glass door leading into the kitchen and the back of the house, and he says, I didn't see anybody, I guess he means inside, and saw a piece of paper laying on the floor, looked at it. Now note that he says, saw a piece of paper. Shouldn't he have seen 3 pieces of paper? Anyway, he says, saw a piece of paper laying on the floor, looked at it. It was facing the other direction. Not those pages or the papers were facing the other direction. Read it. And after the first few lines, realized something very strange was happening. And so I ran around to the front of the house and knocked on the door when it was let in. So can you see, he doesn't actually knock on the door. He somehow sees the ransom note where it is and then doesn't even go in on that side, but goes round to the front and knocks on the door and was let in. And so if you think about it, if he was heading that way anyway, why would he go to that part of the house if he was going to the front to be let in on that side anyway? What led him to that part of the house? I'm talking about the kitchen door. Anyway, he's asked, now the document that you picked up, did that prove to be what has been designated as the Ramsey kidnapping note or the note involved in this homicide investigation? And then he answers yes, but he says, I didn't pick it up. It was inside the door and I was outside. The door was locked. I read it through the door. Now, when he says the door was locked, how does he know? Did he try and open the door? Did he leave his fingerprints on the door? How did he know the door was locked? Then is asked, you actually could read some of the language of the note. Fernie, yes. Now, one would actually have to demonstrate that, put a page on the ground and stand out the door, and could you actually read the ransom note from outside looking inside, with it being, I guess, upside down? And what do you think the likelihood is of that? What I think is also quite interesting is the fact that all these friends arrive at the house and none of them actually handle the note either. You would think that would be something that they would all want to do. And that's a part of the narrative that's also missing. Do they want to see the note? Do they know about the note? Surely John Fernie mentions the note to the other friends that are there. Do the police say to them, sorry, this is evidence, you guys can't really look at it or touch it? And so, anyway, what we know is he doesn't knock on the door, even though he goes to the door. Or did he, or does he just not mention that? But he actually enters the house through the front door, even though he's parked on the other side. Fernie's also adamant that he reads the note through the door. But that suggests the note is on the floor, on the opposite side of the hall, far away from the staircase to where Patsy said that she found it. So did Officer French really pick up the note, read it, and then put it down on the floor right in front of the door? I mean, what we're really asking here, and we should put these words on screen, is how did the note get from where Patsy found it to where John Fernie supposedly read it? Now, I don't know about you, I'm having a hard time believing that Fernie either saw the note where he said he saw it, and how he saw it, and when he saw it. If he said he saw it through the kitchen window, that could sort of make sense, because there's also nothing in the police report about French taking the note and then putting it somewhere and abandoning it again. But of course, he doesn't say that he saw it through the kitchen window. He says he saw it on the floor through the door, which really doesn't make any sense. Again, how did it get there? But before we get too confident about dismissing or criticizing Fernie's testimony, have a look at Officer Rick French's report. According to his report, the note was on the wooden floor very close to the entrance to the kitchen. That is when he arrived. Look at these words. He says, the handwritten note was laid on the wooden floor just west, and you can't see it there, but it's actually just west of the kitchen. And John told me that his wife had found the note on the bottom step. So that is where John says the note was found. But when the officer comes in, he finds it on the wooden floor, which suggests that John picked it up and put it down there. Now, it still doesn't explain how the note got from the stairs to the floor, let alone all the way to the other side of the floor, but it does seem to reinforce Fernie's version of events. And instead of casting suspicion on John Fernie or even on the police, I think there's another possibility here. Now, to be clear, no one actually saw the ransom note on the stairs except Patsy and possibly John. When officers arrived at the scene, as I say, it was on the floor where it was likeliest to be contaminated, dirtied, even stepped on, possibly even torn. Was that the idea? And perhaps the fact that there were no fingerprints on the note, perhaps that would remain hidden. Perhaps that was a problem for the writer of the ransom note, and that needed to be contaminated or hidden or distorted or disguised if the note was damaged by being stepped on. Anyway, let's go back to the transcript. Now, how long were you at the Ramsey house on that day? John Fernie answers, until, it was a very chaotic day. I think what he wanted to say was until John Bonet's body was found. But he says, my recollection is it was probably until about 2 or 3 o'clock that afternoon. Remember, John Bonet's body was found at about 1 p.m., just after 1 p.m. And so he remained there around about an hour after that, possibly 2. Then he's asked, let me ask you, if I might, if you recall, who, other than police officers or civilian people that you are familiar with, that came to the house at about that time you arrived? Unfortunately, again, he doesn't say at what time did you arrive. And so he says, Fleet and Priscilla White were there when I arrived, and my wife came shortly thereafter. That's also quite interesting.
Hold on 1 second.
But that can't be right. Fleet and Priscilla White were there when he arrived. Well, not according to Lawrence Schiller. Let's have a look at what he says. At 6 a.m., the telephone awakened Cliff Gaston. It was Patsy Ramsey. Priscilla took the call, and within minutes the Whites were dressed and on their way to the Ramseys' house. Now, what doesn't really make sense with this is, at 6 a.m., Officer French is already there. So is Patsy on the phone within a minute or two of Officer French arriving? That doesn't seem to be true either. In any event, when they arrived, the police and John Fernie were already there. That means when the Whites arrived, John Fernie was already there. Patsy was on the floor, hysterical. Remember, the ransom note's also on the floor. And her husband was trying to comfort her. It was still dark outside. White told the detectives that he had been there only a few minutes when he started to search the house. Now, the fact that it's still dark outside is also a way that you might trample the ransom note because it's dark.
Not what you said.
So did Fernie get there first, or did the Whites get there first? Now, if you go through John and Patsy's statements, they are asked the order in which the friends were called, and they can't seem to remember. Patsy can't even remember whether John Fernie or Barbara Fernie answered. In their book, the Ramseys seem more certain, though, indicating they called the Fernies first. This is an important question because if it's true that John Fernie arrived close to 6 a.m., and if Patsy called 911 from about 5:52 to 5:53 a.m., then the issue emerges that if it's a 10-minute, 3.6-mile drive, and that was measured by Cottonstar, I'll put a link to that particular drive, that video of him making that drive in the description. But if it's a 10-minute drive from the Fernies to the Ramseys, did the Ramseys possibly call the Fernies before calling 911? Now, hypothetically, if that's true and if that can be proved, which is another thing entirely, then one might say calling the Fernies first, as I say, if that happened, well, could that have involved the intention of creating interference and confusion? In other words, if the officers arrived when the friends arrived, well, can you imagine what could happen? It distracts attention from them. I mean, the Ramseys, it makes it harder to figure out what's wrong with the ransom note because there's this mayhem and cacophony and people talking. There's also the question of footprints in the snow. Is that going to be added or subtracted from the scene? You know, it possibly does a lot besides. You know, as I say, the friends can leave tracks in the snow and can perhaps emerge as suspects as well. Remember, the whole time John Bonet is inside the house. So if that is known by someone, isn't that it's a priority to make sure that she isn't found? And so creating all of this, is this a diversion? Is this meant to be a diversion? So if the hypothetical is true, then hypothetically maybe someone doesn't want her found, and perhaps a lot of this distraction is meant to delay finding her, and isn't that exactly what happened? Now, unfortunately, like so much in the Ramsey case, things just aren't clear-cut. You might have that theory, but it's not quite as simple as that in terms of verifying it or testing it. Now, while some reports have Fernie arriving first at 6:01 a.m., that's sort of one of the official statements, Paula Woodward doesn't mention Fernie's name, but describes the route that he says he took, and the fact that he seems to arrive just 2 minutes after Officer French, but before Officer Reichenbach. Now, it doesn't mean whether if Schiller says something that is definitive and absolutely true, or if Paula Woodward does, these are simply sources that provide fairly authoritative versions of the events that we need to take cognizance of. But if you think about it, what's important to remember is that it was Officer Reichenbach that said he observed no footprints in the snow. But how could that be? How could there be no footprints in the snow if John Fernie had already walked through that area? And so certainly what that suggests, if Officer Reichenbach observed accurately, what that suggests is that Officer Reichenbach got there before John Fernie did, which means John Fernie got there actually a little bit later, which would make sense given how far it was for John Fernie to drive, a 10-minute drive. Also, and this is a really important point, if Fernie had left footprints in the snow, then there was snow after all. So you can't say what Lou Smit has been saying all along that, well, how can there be footprints because there was no snow? But if Fernie had left footprints in the snow, then there was snow after all. And there are about 20 references to John Fernie in Schiller's book. That's about a quarter as many references as there are to Fleet White. But this is the one that stands out, and it's Fernie complaining about the footprints in the snow story. And since we already had about 25 minutes of this in terms of this video, we'll deal with that in a part 2 to this Peripheral Characters series dealing with John Fernie. So for now, I'm not going to take it further than that. Please let me know in the comments whether you're finding this interesting, whether you're learning anything, and whether you'd like me to dig into this even deeper than I already have. But for now, thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.